Tokyo, night of November 24, 1944. The city sleeps beneath a thin veil of winter haze. Factories hum along the Sumida River, and distant sirens whine half-heartedly. Another false alarm, people think. The war feels far away, then a low vibration cuts through the air. Not the familiar drone of Japanese bombers returning from China. This sound is deeper, heavier, relentless. Lookouts on Tokyo Bay raise their binoculars and freeze. Tiny silver dots move steadily across the moonlit sky, higher than any Japanese fighter can reach. Moments later, the first explosions ripple across the Musashino aircraft works, fire blooming like orange flowers against the night. Down below, families rush from their homes, staring upward in disbelief. The enemy had finally come, not as fleets on the ocean, but as steel giants from the edge of the world. Above the clouds, the B-29 crews watch the glow spread across the horizon. Tokyo is burning, and this is only the beginning. In the early years of World War II, Japan's war machine stood unmatched across the Pacific. From the fall of Singapore in February 1942 to the burning oil fields of the Dutch East Indies, every island seemed to fall before the rising sun. Imperial admirals believed their mastery of naval warfare, not industrial production, would decide the conflict. Across the ocean, America was still waking up from its own nightmare, Pearl Harbor. The U.S. military, though vast on paper, faced a logistical problem no other nation in history had confronted: distance. Japan's homeland lay thousands of miles beyond the range of any Allied bomber. Even if American carriers drew close enough to strike, they could never sustain the kind of continuous air assault that crushed German cities in Europe. For the Japanese leadership, this oceanic buffer felt eternal. "No enemy aircraft shall ever reach our skies," declared official broadcasts in 1942. The Imperial Navy's Zero fighters and defensive perimeter at Rabaul, Truk, and the Marianas were seen as an impenetrable wall. Japan's generals focused on China and Southeast Asia, confident that any American response would be slow and scattered. But far to the east, in the factories of Wichita, Seattle, and Marietta, a new kind of aircraft was taking shape. While Japanese engineers refined older models like the Mitsubishi Ki-67, American designers were building something no nation had ever attempted: a bomber that could fly farther, higher, and faster than any interceptor in existence. The Pacific, once considered a natural moat, was about to become a highway. By mid-1943, Japan's military situation had begun to crack. The defeat at Midway had cost the Imperial Navy its best carriers and most experienced pilots. In the jungles of New Guinea and on the beaches of Guadalcanal, Japanese troops were discovering the full force of American industry. For every plane Japan lost, the U.S. built 10. For every ship sunk, another 2 joined the fleet. Yet inside Tokyo's naval headquarters, the same arrogance persisted. Reports from intelligence officers in Switzerland and Bangkok about a super bomber under development in the United States were dismissed as exaggeration. Even when U.S. propaganda leaflets mentioned an aircraft capable of striking Japan from India or the Pacific Islands, admirals laughed it off. The nation's radar network was primitive, its air defense coordination weak, but few believed it mattered. Japan's leaders saw time as their ally. They assumed America's will would break long before its bombers reached Tokyo. Meanwhile, across the Pacific, time was exactly what the Americans were racing against. The war in Europe consumed resources, but Washington demanded a solution for Japan, one that didn't require a million-man invasion. The answer lay in the Boeing B-29 Superfortress, a project so vast and secret that it consumed more money than the Manhattan Project itself. By 1944, the pieces were aligning. Saipan and Tinian had fallen to the U.S. Marines, opening the skies to Japan's doorstep. The Superfortress, with its pressurized cabin and 4 Wright R-3350 engines, could carry 5 tons of bombs over 3,000 miles and return home. In Tokyo, the War Ministry received its first confirmed reports of American planes spotted over Kyushu. The High Command dismissed them as reconnaissance. "Impossible," one officer reportedly muttered. "No bomber flies that far." They were wrong, and by the time the truth became clear, the enemy was already preparing to strike Japan's heart. In the shadow of American industry, the B-29 was born out of urgency and fear. By late 1940, U.S. military planners already understood that defeating Japan would demand more than carriers and island assaults. It would require the ability to strike the enemy's mainland directly, to burn away its capacity for war. The Boeing company, then already producing the B-29 Flying Fortress, was given an almost impossible challenge: design a bomber that could carry heavier loads, fly at over 30,000 feet, and travel distances no existing aircraft could endure. The resulting machine, the B-29 Superfortress, would become the most advanced bomber of World War II. Its creation pushed American engineering to the edge. Each aircraft required nearly 100,000 precision parts and over 60 miles of wiring. It had a pressurized crew compartment, something unheard of in combat aircraft at the time. Its remote-controlled gun turrets were guided by analog computers, allowing gunners to target enemy fighters with astonishing accuracy. Factories ran around the clock. Women, students, and retirees joined the assembly lines. By 1943, over 60,000 workers were laboring on the B-29 project, scattered across 4 major production plants: Wichita, Marietta, Omaha, and Renton. Every rivet, every curve represented a nation's will to reach the unreachable. But such ambition came with failure. Early test flights were plagued by fires, overheating engines, and accidents that killed several crews. The Wright R-3350 engines, powerful but unstable, threatened to ground the entire project. Engineers worked through the nights, redesigning cowling systems and improving cooling ducts. Pilots nicknamed the bomber the Widowmaker. Yet despite the danger, the project pressed forward. In Washington, General Henry Hap Arnold, head of the U.S. Army Air Forces, refused to back down. "The B-29 is the weapon that will end the war," he told his staff. He poured $3 billion into the program, demanding it fly before 1944. It was the largest single weapons investment in American history up to that time. Meanwhile, on the other side of the Pacific, Japan's intelligence apparatus, once feared for its reach, was breaking down. After years of censorship, isolation, and overconfidence, its spies failed to understand what the Americans were building. Reports from neutral countries describing 4-engine bombers flying higher than 10,000 meters were dismissed as Allied deception. The Imperial Navy's Air Bureau focused instead on defending the Empire's perimeter. They believed that if the Marianas, Iwo Jima, and Formosa were held, Japan would be safe. None anticipated that the Americans would capture these islands and turn them into giant floating airfields of concrete and steel. When Saipan fell in July 1944, Japan's admirals were stunned, not because of the island's loss, but because they suddenly realized what it meant. From Saipan to Tokyo was only 1/500 miles, well within the B-29's range. By August, radar operators in Kyushu began reporting unidentified aircraft flying high above their detection ceiling. Fighters scrambled only to find nothing. The B-29s were flying at altitudes unreachable by most Japanese interceptors. In Tokyo, a few skeptical officers began to warn that the United States had achieved something extraordinary. But their voices were drowned in bureaucracy and pride. The Imperial General Headquarters, still convinced of Japan's divine protection, delayed reinforcing homeland defenses. And so, when the first B-29s appeared over the capital on that cold night in November 1944, Japan's air defenses were confused, fragmented, and utterly unprepared. The most advanced bomber in the world had just arrived over one of the most vulnerable cities on Earth. At 30,000 feet, war felt detached, but never distant. Inside the narrow pressurized fuselage of a B-29, 11 men lived in a fragile bubble of oxygen and steel. Their world was sealed by hissing airlocks and vibrating aluminum walls. Outside, the temperature fell below -40 degrees. For these young American airmen, most in their early 20s, the B-29 was both a miracle and a monster. Missions stretched for 10, sometimes 12 hours. Each man carried more than gear. He carried the knowledge that a single engine fire could consume the entire plane before the crew could bail out. They flew from newly captured islands, Saipan, Tinian, and Guam, airfields carved from coral under relentless heat. Mechanics slept beside the runways, fixing engines by lantern light. Pilots memorized weather charts of the jet stream, a new phenomenon barely understood. They would ride those winds toward Japan, their bomb bays filled with destruction. Each takeoff was a gamble. Fully loaded, a B-29 weighed nearly 70 tons. Engines strained, Wheels lifted, and for a few seconds the aircraft seemed to hover between life and death before clawing into the sky. Every man aboard knew, if one engine failed before altitude, they wouldn't make it home. Yet despite the danger, morale stayed high. They believed, or needed to believe, that every mission would shorten the war. For them, Japan wasn't a city of people. It was a target of strategy, a place that had begun the war with Pearl Harbor. They carried the burden of vengeance, the cold arithmetic of modern warfare. Far below, no one in Tokyo knew their names. In Tokyo's naval ministry, the mood in late 1944 was one of disbelief. The Imperial Navy and Army had long quarreled over air defense responsibilities. The Navy guarded the coasts. The Army controlled homeland airfields. Between them, coordination collapsed. Radar coverage was patchy. Fighter command had no centralized control. When the first B-29 raid struck Yawata and Omura, senior officers dismissed the damage as minor. They will not sustain such attacks, one report concluded. The assumption was that America's bombers were stretched too thin, too far from home. The problem was not technology, but it was mindset. Japan's military had been built on offensive spirit, not defensive innovation. The idea of building thousands of radar towers, searchlight networks, and interceptor squadrons for homeland protection seemed wasteful. Even as reports from the Marianas showed massive American construction, few realized its purpose until it was too late. By the time Japan began developing effective countermeasures, like the Nakajima Ki-84, Hayate and the rocket-propelled J-8M, the B-29s were already flying unchallenged at altitudes Japanese fighters struggled to reach. Admiral Soemu Toyota, one of Japan's senior naval strategists, later admitted that the High Command did not take seriously the threat of large-scale air raids upon the homeland until after the damage had become evident. It was a fatal underestimation, born from years of propaganda and pride. The B-29 was not merely an aircraft. It was a technological revolution. Its pressurized cabin allowed crews to fly above 30,000 feet, beyond the reach of most anti-aircraft guns. It carried a range of over 3,200 miles, extending the U.S. Air Force's hand deep into the Japanese homeland. Its defensive system was a marvel. 5 remotely operated gun turrets, each guided by a central analog computer known as the General Electric Central Fire Control System. A single gunner could control multiple turrets, calculating deflection angles faster than human reflexes could manage. Against interceptors, this automation made the B-29 a fortress in the sky. Navigation too evolved. Celestial navigation was combined with radar mapping and LORAN systems, allowing crews to locate Japanese cities even through cloud cover. For the first time, bombers could strike targets with precision without ever seeing the ground. But perhaps the greatest leap was psychological. The B-29 symbolized industrial inevitability, a machine that fused science, manpower, and national purpose. Each sortie over Japan was a statement. America could now wage war from anywhere on Earth. Japanese engineers watched in despair. Their own aircraft, once superior in agility, were now relics compared to this Leviathan. They lacked the fuel, materials, and time to create a counter. The skies over Tokyo had become a laboratory of 20th century warfare. By the end of 1944, the U.S. bombing campaign over Japan faced an unexpected problem: precision. Despite the B-29's advanced technology, high-altitude bombing proved far less accurate than planners hoped. The jet stream, powerful winds reaching 200 miles per hour, scattered bombs miles off target. Crews returned frustrated, their payloads wasted on empty fields. Into this chaos stepped General Curtis E. LeMay, a man whose name would become synonymous with both innovation and terror. At just 38, LeMay was already a veteran of the European Air War. His methods were ruthless, his focus absolute. He believed wars were won by breaking an enemy's capacity and their will to resist. Upon assuming command of the B-29 Bomber Command in the Marianas, LeMay studied the reports with cold precision. High-altitude precision raids weren't working. Japan's industries were too dispersed, its weather too unpredictable. The answer, he decided, was not to aim smaller, but to strike harder. LeMay ordered a complete shift in tactics. The B-29s would abandon daylight raids. They would fly at night at low altitude and use incendiary bombs instead of high explosives. Japan's cities, made largely of wood and paper, would become the targets themselves. It was an audacious plan bordering on madness. Crews were uneasy. Flying heavy bombers at 5,000 feet without armor sounded suicidal. But LeMay's logic was unflinching. If you kill enough of them, he said, they stop fighting. And so, under his command, the air war turned from strategic bombing to systematic destruction. The B-29 would no longer chase factories, it would chase fire. In the heart of Japan's cities lay their greatest vulnerability. Unlike Europe, Japan had built upward and outward in wood and paper, a legacy of centuries-old tradition. Houses were connected by narrow lanes, their eaves touching. Entire neighborhoods were tinderboxes. Tokyo, Osaka, Nagoya, and Kobe, great industrial centers, were also densely packed residential zones. Factories operated beside homes. Schools doubled as workshops. It was a society mobilized for total war, yet still clinging to ancient materials. When the first small incendiary raids hit in December 1944, Japanese authorities were stunned by the results. Fire spread faster than their emergency crews could react. But rather than evacuate civilians, the government emphasized discipline. Air defense drills continued, yet few shelters could withstand real flame. Ordinary citizens lived under illusions. Propaganda assured them the capital was invincible. Even when leaflets warned of firebombs that will rain from the sky, many dismissed it as American bluff. Families stored buckets of water on rooftops, a symbolic defense against what was coming. As the raids intensified, the Japanese home front began to unravel. Night after night, sirens howled and families huddled beneath tatami mats, listening to the distant thunder of engines. Children learned to identify the difference between lone reconnaissance planes and full formations. Every man and woman was trained to form bucket brigades, though most knew it would make no difference. And above it all, Japan's leadership still believed it could endure. Admiral Toyota declared that the spirit of the Japanese people would overcome any material disadvantage. "Our hearts are our fortress," he proclaimed in a 1945 broadcast. But spirit would not stop napalm. By early March 1945, LeMay had prepared his ultimate experiment, Operation Meeting House, the concentrated firebombing of Tokyo. He calculated wind speed, humidity, and flammability. Planning the strike like an engineer designs a combustion engine. The target was no longer a factory or a dockyard. It was a living city of nearly 4 million people. March 9, 1945. The sun had long dipped beneath the horizon, leaving a pale crescent moon over the Marianas. On the coral airfields of Tinian, Saipan, and Guam, hundreds of B-29s waited in lines of steel and shadow. Engines idled, humming like restless predators. Crews climbed aboard, checking instruments, strapping themselves into pressurized cabins and running last-minute diagnostics. Each man knew what was at stake, yet nerves mingled with a cold efficiency born of routine. The bomb bays were loaded with M69 incendiaries, small cylinders filled with jellied gasoline, designed to ignite wooden cities instantly. The weight pressed down on the struts and tires of the bombers, a silent reminder that each takeoff was a calculated gamble. At 18 hours, the first planes rolled down the coral strips, wheels screeching against tarmac. The island air was thick with exhaust, the smell of burning oil mingling with sweat and fear. Once airborne, the bombers climbed to a low altitude of 5,000 feet, trading safety for precision. The night was clear, but the wind and a merciless tail of the winter jet stream threatened to scatter their payloads. Above Japan, radar screens in Tokyo detected unusual formations. Air defense officers scrambled to identify the approaching threat. Interceptor squadrons were dispatched, but most pilots never reached the enemy. B-29s were simply too high for conventional fighters and too fast to predict. For those who glimpsed the bombers, the machines appeared as silver shadows, gliding silently over a sleeping city. At 23 hours, the first incendiaries fell. Buildings caught fire almost instantly, the flames dancing atop wooden roofs. Narrow lanes became channels for spreading fire. Neighborhoods erupted in orange and black. Smoke rose like dark clouds consuming the night sky. From inside the bombers, crews watched through reinforced glass. Some recorded the fires with cameras, others simply stared. One young pilot later recalled, "It looked like the city was alive, burning itself." There was beauty and horror at once. Meanwhile, below, firefighters and emergency crews scrambled. Buckets and hoses were useless against the intensity of thousands of simultaneous blazes. Streets were blocked by fallen timber and smoldering debris. Panic spread, but organized evacuation was impossible. Tokyo's population density made movement treacherous. The Japanese High Command initially thought the attacks were minor raids, but reports from multiple districts began to arrive simultaneously. Firestorms were forming. Wind was drawing flames together, creating tornadoes of fire that consumed entire neighborhoods in minutes. Tokyo's wooden heart was proving catastrophically vulnerable. By midnight, the firestorm had merged into a single immense inferno. Temperatures inside the flames reached 1,800 degrees Fahrenheit, incinerating houses, factories, and lives indiscriminately. The B-29s flying above remained unscathed, ghosts in the sky untouchable and precise. Admirals and generals watching reports from bunkers could only grasp fragments of reality. Communications were overloaded. The sheer scale of destruction was incomprehensible. By dawn, the Japanese leaders would confront a terrifying truth. The enemy's bomber was not just a machine. It was a tool that had rendered traditional defenses meaningless. This first night would leave over 100,000 people homeless, kill nearly 100,000, and mark a turning point in the Pacific War. Tokyo's skyline, once a symbol of imperial power, was now a furnace of human suffering. Above the smoke and fire, LeMay's B-29 circled, ensuring each incendiary found its mark. The mission was a success in the cold logic of strategy, but it also revealed the full moral weight of modern aerial warfare. And yet, even as flames consumed entire districts, the Japanese High Command was forced to acknowledge a painful reality. The B-29 was unstoppable at this stage of the war. Every calculation, every assumption about defending the homeland had been shattered in a single night. March 10, 1945, Tokyo had never known a night like this. The city's dense wooden districts, narrow alleys, and paper structures had become a single, raging inferno. The firestorm generated its own winds, sucking oxygen and hurling flames across neighborhoods like living creatures. Temperatures soared, reaching the point where metal warped and asphalt melted. Below, civilians ran blindly. Families clutched children, desperately searching for water or open space only to find streets blocked by burning debris. The government's civil defense brigades, poorly trained and under-equipped, were overwhelmed. Firefighters attempted to form bucket chains, but their efforts were swallowed by the inferno. In some districts, the roar of fire was so loud it drowned out screams and sirens. Meanwhile, the B-29 crews maintained formation high above. They dropped incendiaries with methodical precision, timing runs to exploit wind patterns. Some navigators noted the eerie calm of altitude contrasted with the chaos below. One bombardier wrote later in his diary, "We were above a sea of fire, everything moving yet still. I had never seen power like that, nor feared it less." Japanese interceptors attempted to respond, but most pilots were grounded or shot down. The B-29s were simply beyond reach, flying higher than the Zero, faster than the Ki-84, and too numerous to target effectively. Anti-aircraft batteries fired blindly, shells exploding harmlessly below the bombers. The defenders were spectators to a war they had no hope of winning that night. Admirals and generals in Tokyo, previously confident in the city's defenses, now faced a terrifying reality. Reports of destruction poured in. Entire districts erased in minutes, tens of thousands of casualties, fires spreading at a speed no firefighting plan could match. By mid-evening, it became clear. Japan's homeland defenses had failed catastrophically. The human toll was staggering. Casualties reached near 100,000 killed, another million injured, and countless more displaced. Hospitals were overwhelmed, transportation blocked, communications fractured. Tokyo, once the nerve center of an empire, had become a city of ruins. Strategically, the raid accomplished exactly what LeMay had intended. Japan's industrial capacity was disrupted, military morale shattered, and civilian populations terrorized into submission. The B-29 had demonstrated that distance and geography no longer protected the homeland. Yet even amidst the destruction, there were stories of survival and resilience. Families huddled in ponds and riverbanks finding refuge from the flames. Workers and soldiers improvised fire breaks where they could. But these stories were exceptions in a night defined by overwhelming loss. The Japanese High Command faced a bitter reckoning. Admiral Toyota, once dismissive of the B-29 threat, later reflected on the raid. "We had ignored intelligence, underestimated their technology, and assumed our cities would be untouchable." That night proved how dangerously wrong we were. By dawn, the first light revealed the aftermath. Tokyo smoldered beneath a haze of smoke, its skyline unrecognizable. Streets were unpassable, wooden houses reduced to ash, and survivors emerged into a landscape that seemed more like a battlefield than a city. The psychological impact was as profound as the physical destruction. Citizens who had once believed in the invincibility of the empire now confronted the stark reality of modern aerial warfare. Japan's leaders, too, faced a sobering truth. The B-29 was not a temporary threat. It was a decisive instrument that had forever changed the calculus of war in the Pacific. The raid also marked a turning point for the Allied strategy. LeMay's success with incendiary low-altitude bombing would be repeated in other Japanese cities, setting the stage for a campaign that culminated in the atomic bombings months later. The era of high-altitude precision bombing had given way to total urban destruction, and so Tokyo burned, not as an accident of war but as a deliberate demonstration of industrial and military supremacy. In that firestorm, technology, strategy, and human vulnerability collided, leaving an indelible mark on history. By dawn on March 10, 1945, Tokyo lay in ruins. Smoke still rose from smoldering neighborhoods, curling over streets once lined with wooden homes, shops, and schools. Entire blocks had vanished. Roofs collapsed into heaps of timber and ash. The city's industrial infrastructure, factories, warehouses, and transport hubs, had been severely damaged, yet it was the civilian toll that stunned both the Japanese and the world. Estimates from the Japanese government indicated nearly 100,000 dead, with over 1 million left homeless. Hospitals overflowed with burns, smoke inhalation, and trauma cases. Corpses littered streets. Makeshift morgues were established in public buildings, temples, and parks. Survivors wandered dazed through the wreckage, searching for family, water, or even a single roof to protect them from the cold. Emergency response was chaotic. Fire brigades, trained yes, but overwhelmed, had no effective means to fight firestorms of such magnitude. Bucket brigades were insufficient. Water mains had ruptured. Streets clogged with debris prevented vehicles from reaching burning districts. In the first hours, the firestorm itself became an enemy, moving unpredictably with the wind and consuming everything in its path. Japanese military leadership struggled to comprehend the scale. Reports from the front lines were fragmented. Communication lines had been destroyed. The Imperial Navy and Army realized that their homeland defenses, once assumed adequate, were catastrophically ineffective against high-altitude long-range bombers. Admiral Somu Toyota, previously confident in the Navy's protective perimeter, later reflected on the devastation. We had ignored intelligence, underprepared, and underestimated the enemy's capacity. The city's burning was a harsh lesson in humility. His words echoed the sentiments of countless officers who had believed Tokyo to be untouchable. From the U.S. perspective, the raid was an operational triumph. The B-29s returned with minimal losses, a testament to both the aircraft's advanced design and the ineffectiveness of Japanese air defenses at the time. Strategically, the success validated General Curtis LeMay's tactics. Low-altitude night incendiary raids could devastate industrial cities with unprecedented efficiency. Yet the human cost raised moral questions even among American planners. The sheer scale of civilian casualties, combined with the near-total destruction of residential districts, made Operation Meeting House one of the deadliest single air raids in history. Historians later estimated that over 16 square miles of Tokyo had been destroyed, leaving an urban wasteland where life, commerce, and infrastructure had existed the night before. Socially, the firebombing left an indelible psychological impact. Survivors carried trauma, fear, and grief into the weeks and months ahead. Families were scattered. Neighborhoods dissolved. Cultural landmarks were lost. Tokyo had transformed from a vibrant metropolis into a symbol of vulnerability, the first major urban center to experience the destructive potential of America's new aerial technology. On a military level, Japan's leadership scrambled to adjust. Air defense efforts intensified, with new fighter deployments and anti-aircraft batteries hastily arranged. However, structural weaknesses, poor coordination between Army and Navy, inadequate radar coverage, and insufficient pilot training made these efforts largely reactive and insufficient. By the time new defenses were implemented, B-29 raids were already planned for other major cities. The first night of March 9-10 had proven one undeniable truth. Japan could no longer rely on geography, tradition, or pride to protect its homeland. The war had entered a new phase, one where American industrial might and technological innovation dictated the tempo and scale of destruction. In the weeks following the firebombing of Tokyo, the full scope of devastation became clear. The physical damage was staggering. Over 16 square miles of densely populated city destroyed, tens of thousands dead, and 1 million displaced. But the impact was not limited to rubble and ash. Japan's military and political leadership faced a new reality, one in which the B-29 dictated the tempo of war, and the homeland was no longer invulnerable. The Imperial General Headquarters, previously confident in the protective shield of the home islands, scrambled to respond. Radar installations were expanded, additional fighter squadrons were deployed, and anti-aircraft defenses hastily reinforced. Yet these measures could only slow the inevitable. The B-29s could fly higher than most interceptors, carry heavier loads than traditional bombers, and strike from distances previously thought impossible. Japan's engineers, constrained by fuel shortages and production limits, were powerless to match the scale of American industry. Strategically, the U.S. had proven the effectiveness of low-altitude incendiary bombing. Cities such as Osaka, Nagoya, and Kobe became the next targets, and the pattern of destruction established in Tokyo was repeated across the country. The firebombing campaign crippled transportation networks, destroyed industrial facilities embedded within residential areas, and forced Japan to divert resources away from frontline operations to protect the home islands. Beyond the immediate destruction, the psychological effect on Japanese leadership and civilians was profound. Admiral Toyota and other senior officers acknowledged in post-war testimonies that their assumptions about the invulnerability of the homeland were shattered. The military's aura of invincibility, once a cornerstone of propaganda, had collapsed. Civilians, traumatized by repeated raids, began to question the government's ability to protect them, creating fissures in morale that would echo through the final months of the war. The B-29 raids also influenced U.S. strategic calculations. The successful demonstration of mass incendiary bombing confirmed that aerial supremacy could shorten the war without a costly invasion of the Japanese mainland. While debates persisted over civilian casualties, planners recognized that the combination of high-altitude technological superiority and low-altitude tactical innovation had rendered traditional Japanese defenses obsolete. By mid-1945, the operational success of the B-29 campaign over Japan had created a dual effect. It weakened the Japanese war economy and shifted military psychology. The repeated destruction of major urban centers forced the Japanese to reconsider military priorities, diverting troops from offensive operations abroad to defend the homeland. At the same time, the U.S. achieved a new level of dominance in the Pacific, demonstrating that no city, no matter how distant, was beyond reach. Civilian testimony from Tokyo, collected in the immediate aftermath, described a city in shock. Survivors recounted fleeing flames, losing family members, and witnessing neighborhoods vanish in minutes. Schools, temples, and cultural landmarks had burned. The firebombing campaign did not merely destroy infrastructure, it dislocated a society, eroded confidence in leadership, and left an enduring impression of vulnerability. The night of March 9th at 10 was not an isolated event. It marked a turning point in the Pacific War, where technology, strategy, and human cost converged. The B-29 had proven itself not merely as a weapon of destruction, but as a tool of psychological warfare, capable of undermining morale, disrupting governance, and forcing strategic recalibration. Ultimately, the Tokyo firebombing set a precedent. The U.S. military recognized that further raids would be both militarily effective and politically decisive. Japan, confronted with the limits of its defenses, faced the inevitability of continued aerial devastation. The groundwork was laid for the final devastating attacks on Hiroshima and Nagasaki. But before that, every major city on the Japanese home islands was exposed to the merciless reach of the Superfortress. Tokyo burned not just from bombs, but from the collision of overconfidence and innovation. The city, once a symbol of imperial might, became a crucible of modern warfare, a place where technology, strategy, and human vulnerability intersected with devastating clarity. The B-29 Superfortress was more than an aircraft. It was a statement. It demonstrated the power of industrial ingenuity, the precision of engineering under pressure, and the ability of one nation to project force across thousands of miles of ocean. Its wings carried fire, its engines carried destruction, and its presence alone reshaped the calculus of war. For Japan, the raids were a painful awakening. The imperial admirals who had dismissed the threat were forced to confront the limitations of pride, tradition, and conventional thinking. Their homeland, once thought protected by geography and divine favor, had been exposed. Civilian cities built of wood and paper became unintentional victims of strategic calculation. The human toll was immense, yet it underscored a lesson the world would not soon forget. Technological superiority can redefine the boundaries of conflict. For those who flew the B-29, the experience was equally profound. Men stared down at cities ablaze, witnessing the power of their own hands, grappling with the moral weight of war. The thin metal shell separating crew from inferno above Tokyo was also a barrier between strategy and conscience. Historically, the firebombing of Tokyo marked a turning point. It signaled the rise of total aerial warfare, the dominance of industrial capacity over tradition, and the undeniable reality that no city, however distant or revered, was safe in a globalized war. And yet, amid the destruction, reflection remains. The B-29 raids remind us that progress can be both brilliant and terrible, that human ingenuity can save lives and take them, and that history's lessons are often written in fire. In the ash of Tokyo, the world saw both the triumph of technology and the fragility of human civilization. The night the Japanese admirals underestimated the B-29, Tokyo burned, and history was forever altered.